So I think we can start now. There are still a few people entering the room, but I think it's time to begin. So let's get started. First of all, a very warm welcome to this ECIPE webinar in which we want to discuss the so-called Digital Levy initiative from the European Commission. The Digital Levy action follows earlier attempts by the Juncker Commission to impose what I would call special taxes on companies that are considered by policymakers digital companies. And that is mainly companies engaged in online advertising services, online intermediation services, or the trading of data. Serious political discussions at EU level date back to 2017. Since November 2017, the Commission, back then spearheaded by Pierre Moscovici, the French finance commissioner at the Commission, and the Commission's internal tax and tariffs department, they vehemently called for new digital services taxes levied on this particular category of companies. Against this background, against the background of the digital services tax initiative of the Commission, this new digital levy initiative can be considered as a recharged attempt of the EU to impose an EU-wide tax on companies with what we would all agree with very successful digital business models, while at the same time leaving unaddressed the larger flaws of the EU and international corporate tax laws. In its new Inception impact assessment, the Commission argues that digital businesses benefit from scale without mass and do not necessarily pay corporate tax in all jurisdictions in where they have a significant economic presence. It is further claimed that much of the revenues generated by digital companies are based on value created by users and not captured by current tax systems. And on top of these claims, the Commission says that lower taxes or even no taxes at all paid by companies engaged in the digital economy weaken the sustainability of public finances and, moreover, undermine governments' attempts to tackle the COVID-19 crisis and support EU recovery. We've heard similar arguments since 2017 with the original digital services tax proposals. Now, all of these claims are very bold claims. The question is, are they really true and are they justified? And do they merit EU legal intervention? Indeed, little is said by the EU about larger economic implications of new special taxes for companies that provide highly competitive services, digital services that are used and much appreciated by companies, but also citizens, and services that are overwhelmingly used by SMEs to render their businesses profitable. Plenty of analysis and actual industry behavior shows that countries in which digital services taxes exist, that these taxes are passed on to the users of these services in terms of, for example, higher fees for offers placed on online platforms or higher cost of placing advertisements online. Academics, tax professionals, and industry experts also caution that new taxes on digital services would undermine the process of digitalization in the EU, result in double taxation and even overtaxation, particularly for SMEs that extensively use online services to market their products and services in the EU and globally. And it is argued that debates about new special taxes on digital services distract political capital away from much more pressing needs for tax reform in the EU. For example, differences in national VAT laws or differences in laws that govern the taxation of capital and labor. And in the remaining 50 minutes or so, we want to discuss the short and longer term impacts that would arise from a new EU-wide imposed tax on digital services, or as is outlined in the recent Inception impact assessment, even a broader set of companies that to some extent use digital services or operate in areas that are characterized by the diffusion of digital services. And for this discussion, we have two outstanding experts with different professional backgrounds, though. And I'm very glad that we have Marta Becerra on our panel. Marta is the Director of Public Affairs and Institutional Relations at Digital in Madrid. And Digital is the Spanish Association of the Digital Economy, a business organization, an organization that promotes the digitalization of the Spanish economy, representing more than 500 companies in Spain. And I'm also very glad that we have on the panel Daniel Bunn, who is the Vice President of Global Projects at the US Tax Foundation, based in Washington, DC. And Daniel is an outstanding policy expert, outstanding tax policy expert. He and his team of experts are closely following international corporate tax developments, including what is happening on EU soil. And their findings are reflected in the Tax Foundation's annual International Tax Competitiveness Report, a publication that I can very much recommend. Let's proceed as follows. Marta will give us a general overview of what we saw in Spain with regard to legislative actions, but also the economic impacts of the Spanish digital services tax. And we will then turn to Daniel, who will discuss major claims made by policymakers regarding the need for special taxes for certain digital companies and put them into perspective with what I would call the easiest and most transparent form of corporate taxation, and that is sales taxes and value-added taxes. And I'm sure that Daniel can also give us a brief account on what is going on at the OECD regarding attempts to reform the international corporate tax system. So, Marta, let me hand over to you. The floor is yours. And let me also encourage our audience to put their questions in the chat box so that we can refer to this question in the second half of the seminar.
Thank you, Matthias. Good afternoon to you all. And thank you, ECIPE, for inviting us to participate in this very interesting and necessary dialogue. Well, let me first explain, as Matthias already said, Digital is the Spanish Association for Digital Economy. It's a business association, and we've been following the digital tax very closely and, of course, very actively ever since 2017 with that first letter that was also signed by Spain together with Germany, France, and Italy. So here you can see how the Spanish government, it doesn't matter what color, because in 2017 it was the right-wing government, and in 2018 it was the left-wing government. Spain seems to have some sort of agenda with the digital taxation, that it doesn't matter what color of the government it is, that they feel that there's not enough action taken internationally, or that the action taken is not fast enough. So let me give you this outlook about the Spanish situation. It was in 2017 when the Spanish government first signed that letter, urging the European Union to do some sort of conjoint action together to tax the digital economy or the intangible economy, because I think it goes further just than digital activities, right? And it was in 2017 that we had some political instability, that had some electoral campaigning and some new elections. So we had a new government. This was the left-wing government, and inside their electoral program, their electoral promises, they had the digital tax as part of their program, right? So the first draft for the digital tax in Spain, it came out in 2018. Just when the European Union was starting their discussion, and they were thinking about that permanent solution with the permanent establishment or digital presence in the European countries, and with that temporary solution, which was the initial digital tax in the European Union. So what the government did in 2018 was basically translating what the European proposal was for that temporal solution. And they started the legislative process to implement it in Spain. As I said, the political instability in Spain has been quite active for the last few years. And as things were, The initiative and the draft was from 2018, but it wasn't until 2020 that it was approved by Parliament. The thing is that when they approved it only 6-8 months ago, in October last year, they established that it would enter into force in January this year, which is merely 2 months after its passing. Now, the trouble with this has been quite real, because the law was passed, but it wasn't complemented by the application regulations that were needed. May it be the specific decree on how to apply it in the company, or the very simple Q&A that very often the taxation administration publishes to help companies comply with the tax. Now, the truth is that the tax has been into force ever since January, but these application regulations haven't been approved yet. So we have an enforceable tax right now that companies are not yet sure how to apply. They're not yet sure how to calculate the tax. And because these norms haven't been passed yet, the truth is that the first settlement that was due in April had to be delayed until July. Now we're very close to July at this point, and truth is that we still don't have those norms of compliance, which means I'm not sure yet, because the ministry hasn't shared anything at this point, but I think that 2 months before the 2 quarterly settlements that need to be applied in July, we still don't know how to calculate the tax. I believe that it should be delayed once more. Now, our experience with the government and with different stakeholders on lobbying and doing our advocacy activities when it comes to this tax, they have been quite interesting, I have to say. Ever since the tax was passed in 2020, in October, we had a very strong position. Of course, we were very much opposed from the beginning to the tax, but once the tax was passed, we had a very strong position on things such as delaying the first settlement and making it a yearly settlement instead of quarterly. Because once you have such a new tax that really no other country really has, because there are different digital taxes going on in different member states in the EU or in different countries in the globe, but none of them are the same one to each other. So really there's a very high compliance burden here when it comes to this tax, and it's very different from one country to another. This is, of course, a weak favor to that very lofty principle that we have about harmonizing legislation in the EU and in general when it comes to taxation in the global economy. It's always interesting, but yeah, we let go of that principle and we insisted on having this tax. Anyway, so our position was very strong to speak about this first year to let go to a yearly settlement so we could learn how to comply with the tax. We could initiate and have a continuous dialogue with the administration and what you really need, because it's not just the companies that need to comply with it. It's also the administration who needs to know how to read the information that the tax is offering, and they need to have it's not that simple. It's not just as your usual corporate tax where you just go with your profit minus cost, and then you have, very generally speaking, of course, and then you have your result, and on that you apply your tax. So yeah, on this issue, of course, you can imagine that we're not very happy about this, and companies are still deciding or concluding if they need to be, if they are subject to the tax, and if they are, there's still a lot of confusion, so much confusion. I cannot stress this enough about how it needs to be complied with. Now, when it comes to the digital tax in Spain, this is part of the debate in general, but I would like to just very quickly remark the fact that we see in the member states, in the European member states, how different digital taxes are coming up. And again, not one is similar to the other. They each one go for a specific subject or a specific scope. Here again, all of them are trying to ring fence the digital activity that is hardly ring fenced. I mean, we're talking about digitization of the economy in general, and you want to tax a very specific part of general economic activity that is done through digital means. We find evidently as a business association for digital economy that this is this is really not a favor to the digitization of the economy, to the innovation, and to the progress that we are fighting for, and that actually the next generation EU is fighting for too, because one of the pillars is digitization, right? But again, member states are coming up with different taxes and they're not the same. And we were just speaking before how agreements on international agreements, international negotiations and conversations, they're not going fast enough. And then digital taxes come up. And then the next question is going to be how to harmonize all this huge mess that we are creating in the taxation system. And I think it's a good point to really wonder or let us reflect on how the taxation systems should work in a general sense. I mean, taxation is used to, collect that public revenue that is used to finance those public services and the administration and yada, yada, yada. But it should always be in the mind of policymakers that taxation should always apply to the general economic activity. It should never distort economic decisions or business decisions, because this is going to distort competition in general and the economy in general. And ring fencing a specific activity of that we want to promote is simply not the way to do that. And with this general remark, I think I gave a good overview of our situation. So I go back to you, Matthias.
Yeah, thanks, Marta. I mean, that was a very frank outline of what we saw in France, particularly of what doesn't work in France still after the act was passed a few months ago. Let me allow me one frank, also a very general question. You mentioned that support for the digital services tax in Spain did not depend on party color. It did not depend on different political party spectrums or party ideologies, respectively. But do you think the majority of Spaniards is still supporting this tax?
Well, the truth is that the digital tax, or sadly Google tax, as it's been named in Spain and everywhere in general, is quite popular. The color is Spanish political color is very Spain and Europe, and as I am, we're very proud of our welfare state. And when it comes to taxation charge on the businesses, in Spain, there's a general, sadly, general sense by population that maybe businesses should not, they should pay more taxes. And this is what we were just talking about, the perceived tax fairness of the tax systems. This is not specifically to digital, I have to say. This is very generic to the population and the businesses in general. But it is true that in the last few years, and because now we're having to face this pandemic and a lot of extra public expense, there is a sadly general perception that there should be a raised taxation system. But then again, I feel that we should maybe rethink the whole system in general rather than applying specific taxes to specific activities.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my impression also is that it's not only a particular feature of the Spanish moods in the general population. I think also in Germany, there are many people, not sure if it's an increasing number of people, but there are many people that feel that businesses should not exist in the first place. And if they exist, they should be properly taxed. But speaking of corporate taxes in general, corporate taxes in OECD countries, or the revenues from corporate taxes in OECD countries, account for about 9 to 10% of all tax revenues collected by governments. And I once estimated that new taxes on digital services would account for very low, de facto negligible shares on government's total annual tax revenues. You mentioned that different countries apply different DST laws. with different scopes and different coverage of activities, different tax thresholds, and so on and so forth. And I looked into these characteristics, and I found that the share of DST revenues in total tax revenues amount to 0.15% in Austria, for example, 0.05% in France, and 0.29% in Spain. And for Spain, the technical experts union at the finance ministry actually stated that this forecast could be an overestimate. Now, when we hear from the European Commission that not having DSTs in place would undermine the sustainability of public finances, aren't we confronted with a deceptive campaign about what they would like to have, but what doesn't really matter in reality, and distracting attention and political capital away from more salient challenges in corporate tax law or the tax system in general?
I totally agree. And when we talk about the economic impact, the public revenue is clearly overestimated, not just because it is, because, I didn't know the percentage, but in absolute terms, it was a bit less than 1,000 million euros. That is an overestimation because they were trying to pass the budget at that point in time, and they needed to count on more public revenue. But there's also a point that needs to be taken into account, which is the fact that once they start applying the tax, it's not just the administrative burden and the economic burden that comes to the companies, but it's also important to take into account the administrative burden that goes into the administration to comply with the tax, to inspect the tax, to make sure that the tax is compliant and the companies are compliant. And it takes also a lot of time to educate your income tax inspectors, to educate the public, not just the businesses, but the administration itself. It takes a lot of resources, time, and money. And in net terms, I'm pretty sure that it's not going to be a profitable tax for the administration, at least for 5 years. Because, I have experience with other taxes that they applied in Spain that were very much directed to specific activities. And this is something that they used to share with us, that it actually takes a lot of time and money to start making it profitable. So I think that's also important to take into account. And it's something that we haven't seen in the impact assessments from the ministry. Well, let this just be my own complaint to the issue here.
Okay, it's well noted. So thanks for now, Marta. Let's now turn to Daniel.
Thanks, Matthias. That's a great summary of what's been going on in Spain, Marta, and I learned a few things myself. Turning to, I guess, the bigger picture on the European Union level is this question of the digital levy. I think the digital levy has, in some ways, gotten too much attention. And in some ways not enough. And I'll clarify that in a moment. But to be clear on what we're discussing, there was the budget that was agreed to last year that mentioned the need for a digital levy to support the revenue side of that budget. And there was a discussion earlier this year with some policy documents that outlined some options for a digital levy. One option was a corporate income top-up tax on all companies with digital activities in the European Union. Secondly, an option for a tax on revenues from certain digital activities in the EU. And then finally, a tax on business-to-business digital transactions in the EU. I don't necessarily favor any of these options, to be quite honest. But this is getting to where I would say, in some ways, these issues of these options aren't necessarily getting enough attention. The digital levy as a theoretical policy avenue for the European Union to enact a new tax on digital companies gets lots of attention. It's as Matthias and Marta discussed, it's a perceived fairness issue in the EU tax policy debate that mostly foreign, often American, digital companies are perceived to not be paying their, quote, fair share of tax in the EU. and therefore something must be done. And then the attention kind of shifts away from what should be done and the details and the problems with some of those details. So with the policy options that I mentioned, I don't think enough attention has been applied to what these different levers might look like. What a top-up tax just for the digital sector might look like, what the problems with a revenue-based digital tax at the EU level might look like. And this sounds very familiar to what Marta was just talking about as far as the Spanish digital services tax and the prior European Commission proposal for a digital services tax. And then a tax on business-to-business digital transactions sounds to me like you're purposefully throwing sand in the gears of the digitalization process in the EU, ensuring that business costs will go up as they increasingly digitalize their transactions and their relationships with their suppliers and their customers. So I think the general discussion on a digital levy is getting a lot of attention, but when it comes to the details and the challenges and the problems, not just from an administrative point of view in designing and clarifying who's in and out of scope, how much different companies would pay, and what tax authorities they would owe that money to. As Marta was talking about the challenges of the digital service tax in Spain, but also the economic impacts. I think it's really important to think through the incidence of these types of taxes. The digital services tax, the gross-based revenue tax we've seen in several countries throughout Europe and designed similar to the European Commission proposal from a few years ago, has been shown by the behavior of some companies that are in scope, that the incidence, the actual economic burden of that tax falls on end users, falls on customers, falls on the small and medium-sized businesses that rely on online advertising to attract customers. And if you're going to design a tax that has that sort of incidence, that the incidence is on the end user, then I would want to step back and think about whether a gross-based revenue tax or a business-to-business digital transaction tax or some weird top-up tax is the right tool. If the incidence is potentially going to be similar to the digital services tax, then why not use something that everyone recognizes where the incidence is on the end user, that being something like the VAT. And I would recognize that the EU is in the process of digitalizing VAT policy. Matthias mentioned a potential harmonization effort for VAT. And when it comes to the digital economy, digital transactions, digital services that are provided, and in some cases, not I think increasingly so in the EU captured by VAT. Why not look at the success there? Some studies have shown, multi-billion euro revenue impacts from capturing the digital economy through the value-added tax. And in fact, the European Commission's own impact assessment of the digital VAT directive suggested that it would be a benefit of 7 billion euros per year. And to me, that sounds like real money. Relative to the small numbers that have been talked about for the digital services taxes, or even harmonizing the digital services taxes at the EU level. Now, something that Matthias mentioned earlier it brings to mind the arguments that are used in favor of a digital levy or some special kind of tax on the digital economy. It seems that the narrative that different taxes should apply to different industries is underpinned by a misunderstanding of what the tax burden on those different industries are. There's a continuously used talking point by folks in the EU that the digital sector is undertaxed. Even IMF studies show that that's not necessarily the case. If you take a broad and correct relative measure of different industries, digital sectors aren't necessarily undertaxed. Matthias has done his own work on this and has shown that digital companies aren't necessarily undertaxed when you look over the course of time. Now, certainly there are models that take account of all the various tax preferences that EU countries have in play. when it comes to innovative technologies or products and services that would benefit, or companies that would benefit from patent boxes or research and development credits and subsidies like that. And models that account for those can show that a company that is innovative and growing and using some of these policies could have a very low tax burden, but that's very different than saying that in general, digital companies are undertaxed. And I think it's important to have the right kind of perspective on the digital economy and on the tax policy in general. I think it's really important to always work back from principles rather than from political narratives that focus on particular companies or industries. And from a principle approach, I think one of the most valuable principles in corporate tax policies is one of neutrality, where you're not necessarily drawing lines around particular industries or activities, or saying that special rules need to apply because of a political appraisal of a certain type of business. And I think that what we have in this digital levy debate is a complete lack of that approach. There is really a misapplication of principles, I believe, when it comes to the digital levy. When it comes to neutrality, you should be designing tax policies that apply the same rules to everyone. This is why when it comes to the digital levy or digital services taxes and the gross-based approach, gross revenue tax, I think it fails on neutrality even within the digital sector, because when you have a revenue tax, that's going to have a lower economic burden on highly profitable sectors and a higher economic burden on sectors that have lower profit margins. If it's designed on a profit tax, then it's going to be any kind of an equal treatment based on profitability. But there's this lack of principled approach to tax policy in this digital levy that really makes me think that the project is not going to really succeed. Now, Matthias also asked for me to give a brief overview of the international discussions, and I think international discussions on digital tax and the taxation of the digital economy are really important because folks in the US and folks in Europe are aware that with the digital services taxes, beginning with the French digital services tax, it sparked a bit of a trade dispute. There were serious threats from the Trump administration, and now there are continuing investigations and hearings now with the Biden administration with respect to whether these European-style digital services taxes and some digital services taxes in other countries, whether those are unfairly discriminatory against American companies. And there's a potential, I think a really harmful potential for this to become a tax and trade war in the midst of a recovery from the pandemic. And this sort of bilateral dispute between the US and these various EU countries is kind of in the midst of what a lot of countries have been looking for towards a tax peace or a tax truce when it comes to the taxation of the digital economy. So countries around the world, nearly 140 of them, have been working towards changing international tax rules to kind of settle this debate, maybe for a time, not permanently settle. We know things in international relations and global negotiations are not permanently settled, but at least temporarily settle the question of who gets to tax digital companies or who gets to tax large multinationals in general. The US has recently offered to narrow the scope of this project from, well, broaden the scope in one sense from just digital companies, but also narrow the scope of the project to potentially the 100 largest companies. Now, US companies would probably make up a sizable chunk of that largest 100 companies. So in some ways, the US is offering up its own companies for changing the rules of where those companies pay taxes and having impacts on the US tax base. But it's a possibility that there will be agreement that could lead to the elimination or the removal of these various digital services taxes that have all the problems that I've mentioned before. So for the EU at this time to be exploring yet another tax tool that could create tensions, transatlantic tensions, or tensions that undermine this multilateral negotiation, I think is a real challenge and problem. So then I think through, okay, well, if there's so much political momentum behind this, if there's so much concern, and if we're ignoring principles anyway, how can I work my own solution into this process? And that's where I get back to the VAT. The digitalization of the VAT is where policymakers should continue to invest time and invest policy implementation to be able to get to a system that is sufficiently raising revenue post-pandemic to finance government needs in a way that also captures the digital economy. I don't think it's necessarily a fair system to say that digital services should be excluded from VAT. So expanding VAT to include digital services as well as in-person services kind of makes sense, and that's the direction a lot of countries are going. And I would say that that's the direction that should continue to go, rather than creating a new tax tool that has the potential to, number one, undermine digitalization efforts with respect to business transactions, or have direct impacts on the digitalization of SMEs and end users' access to services, but also to not undermine global negotiations at a time when it's possible there will be an agreement. I'm not sure how deep or how lasting the agreement will be, but it could bring a bit of peace in this possible, in the face of a possible tax and trade dispute. So with that, I'll turn it back to Matthias.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel, for giving us this comprehensive account on DST developments and also the developments that you currently see at the OECD level. I recently heard that the EU will proceed with its digital levy perspective, irrespective of what is going on at the OECD level. And perhaps this is basically because the EU is still seeking for an exclusive EU budget that is basically out of the control of budgetary control of the member states, and the digital services tax, in addition to, I think, waste or recycling taxes and so on, are a part of this funding source for this exclusive EU budget. But that is just a side remark. Then you mentioned VAT. I think to me it is the only valid and also legitimate solution if we all agree that there are certain problems with corporate tax code in general, not exclusively problems related to the taxation of companies with more digitalized business models. When we look at per capita numbers in Spain, the average citizen pays 1,700 euros in sales taxes every year. For digital taxes, the estimate is 26 euros. So 1,700 in sales taxes, 26 the estimate for digital services taxes. In France, the average citizen pays about 2,600 euros every year in sales taxes. And the estimate for the digital services tax is €7.50 per citizen. So Marta mentioned all of these complexities. It is unclear whether either companies or tax collection bodies will actually manage to declare and collect these taxes properly. It adds enormous amount of complexity to an already very complex and intransparent corporate tax regime. So Daniel, my question to you, we, ECIPE, we are also a political economy think tank looking into different interests, public policy interests, business interests, our stakeholders' interests. Daniel, what are the obstacles to simpler rules to achieve more transparency, to achieve more perceived fairness in taxation? Who's against corporate tax rules or simpler corporate tax rules? Is it businesses? Is it tax advisory companies, which, by the way, also advise the European Commission? Or is it simply the man on the street or the woman on the street pushing policymakers to tax corporate entities in general and call for higher digital services taxes?
So that's a great question. I think one of the things that I have noticed, not necessarily a US phenomenon, but I think something that is really common in Europe, is a skepticism of digital companies when it comes to a public policy discussion. So whether that's the various antitrust initiatives or the tax disputes or design of new tax policies, it seems like there's a popular notion that different digital companies are not doing what Europe would prefer them to do. And then it becomes a design of policy measures that I think are not designed to achieve the ends that they want to achieve. One of the things that I think is very trendy these days is coming up with new types of taxes. And some of them aren't necessarily new. They're brought back or ideas from the past, whether it's the discussion of new wealth taxes or revisiting wealth taxes or new corporate excess profit taxes, or even special levies on particular industries like the digital levy. When I see these policy proposals, I see policymakers who are thinking that they themselves are innovative, that they themselves are leading change, leading the debate, and making progress in pushing new policies that could be relevant for the times. However, there's not much analysis of the secondary or tertiary effects of what these policies might do to tax uncertainty, to business investment, to savings, to consumers, and things like that. And I always think that it's important to have policy innovation within the sphere of corporate tax, within the sphere of labor taxes and consumption taxes, and pushing the envelope within these tax tools that we understand and that we know how they work and where the incidence lies, and to be able to improve those tools before designing something new, where, as Marta was talking about, you would have to design a whole, or not design, but develop a whole new staff at your tax enforcement division to be able to enforce this new tax and figure out all the new regulations and things like that, rather than making sure that the existing tax policy tools, again, corporate income taxes, labor taxes, value-added taxes, and even property taxes, ensuring that those are working well and serving your needs for revenues. Now, that's not very popular because people already know what those taxes do. They already, in some cases, love them or hate them. And it doesn't feel to a policymaker as so much of an innovation as the drudgery of cleaning things up from prior changes or various carve-outs. But the truth is, that is where the value is in tax policy, to ensure that current rules are working well and avoid the temptation of potentially creating more problems for yourself by designing something completely new.
Exactly. That would have been a good final statement. We still have a few minutes left to dig into the issue of the incidents that you just mentioned, Daniel, that policymakers should basically know the secondary and even the tertiary effects of the policies. And here we're talking about taxes they ratify and impose. We have one question referring to the tax incidents. There was a reference made to a study from Deloitte from 2019 saying that up to 95% of the digital services taxes will be passed on to local companies and consumers. Now, I know that Amazon, for example, directly passed on the 3% digital services tax in France to companies that sell goods and services on Amazon's platform. Marta, did you experience similar types of behavior from companies operating in Spain? And these could be companies like Amazon, Google, or Facebook in the market for advertising, but also companies like Booking or other online travel agents.
Well, that any sort of corporate tax is going to go in cascade in the value chain. I think it's something that, well, it's widely known. The problem is that maybe is not such a popular fact. Everybody, any economist knows that this is going to happen. Every policymaker knows that this is going to happen, but still talking about a digital tax is at this point very popular. When it comes to what companies have been doing or are going to do with their burden for the digital tax, well, this has been a message from the beginning that there is a risk of the tax of the burden to go down in cascade to the value chain. But Regarding what each company is doing or not doing, I think you should ask. I really cannot answer that. This is a question that could be directed to the companies themselves. But the risk of any tax going down is, I mean, it's so obvious.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, some companies, they do it and they announce that they are going to do it or that they already did it, and others just do it without making much fuss around it. One more question, and I'm encouraging the audience to ask more questions. So please feel free to use the chat function to ask what you have in mind. There's one, I would say, broader question about taxes in general and the need for international coordination in general. One is the digital levy, but there are also other taxes that need international agreement, and there will be even more in the future. Who should be the organization or a group of countries who could take the lead, Daniel?
This is the question for our times, Matthias, because I would say the G7 countries would like it to just be the G7 countries. The G20 would like it to just be the G20, but then the rest of the world thinks, oh no, we can have a discussion at the OECD and have this inclusive framework that's nearly 140 countries. But then there are also discussions going on at the UN level. I've heard the term forum wars being used to discuss at what level should tax policy be agreed to at the international level. And in fact, all of the groups that I mentioned have some negotiating leverage when it comes to these international disputes. There's not really a World Trade Organization for tax. There are these various, tax is very much an individual country sovereign tool, but there are cross-border implications. Even going back to the 1920s and even prior to that, there was recognition that the cross-border aspects of international tax are pretty important, and you need some sort of tax treaties to be able to facilitate trade and investment. And then about a century ago, countries decided that, okay, well, maybe instead of having a truly multilateral forum for tax, let's just work out things bilaterally with tax treaties. And we end up with the situation we have today with thousands and thousands of tax treaties and lots of complications. So when it comes to trying to figure out what forum or what set of countries should agree to and design tax policies, there's not really a good answer. You could have, as I mentioned, the G7 deciding what works for the G7, and then, think of, the G20 as providing critical mass as a percentage of world GDP to be able to have, okay, well, when we're talking about the world output, well, we've got these countries that have decided that taxes are going to look a certain way, and that's going to just have spillover effects to everybody else. But that's not necessarily, we get back to the fairness question, not necessarily fair to future successful economies. So you think of countries that are up and coming, Nigeria, India, Brazil. These countries, should in a way have a spot of the debate as well, to be able to say how they can, to talk about how they can contribute to the discussion of international tax as a way to pave the way for their future success. So honestly, I've said a lot in the last 2 minutes or whatever, but there's not really a good answer unless countries are willing to get together and design a World Trade Organization for tax that has limited authority on cross-border transactions and doesn't just trample on individual country sovereignty. That's really a potential way forward. But those having those bright lines between what is truly cross-border and what is individual country sovereignty is a bit of a challenge. So I'm not one to say that it's a certain country that should lead or a certain number of countries that should lead, but that might be a valuable thing to have, and especially when it comes to dispute resolution. And that's one thing that's really valuable about the World Trade Organization is its dispute resolution and appellate body that, well, hopefully it's back online now, to be able to resolve these different movements away from the stated policy or the rules of joining the WTO. So with that, I'll stop with my non-answer answer and turn it back to you.
No, it was already very insightful. Personally, I would basically support the application of the Tax Foundation to get the status of an international organization, so you can start to compete with fora at the OECD and finally arrive at simpler, more transparent rules for corporate taxation, other forms of taxation. But you spoke about the G20 too. Where do the positions of, let's say, Japan, Australia, but also China and India actually sit when it comes to digital taxation?
When it comes to digital taxation, different countries have very different objectives. There's two pieces to what's being discussed right now at the international level. One is a global minimum tax, and a lot of countries are able to say that they support a backstop to current corporate tax rules that kind of limits tax competition, and that's their priority. They would like to make sure that their tax system is not eroded by activities by countries or companies using low tax jurisdictions or shifting profits artificially. But there's another piece to it, which another group of countries are interested in, and that is changing where companies pay taxes. And that's where the policy proposal from the US recently to change where just the 100 largest multinationals pay taxes, and that would say to market countries where the customers are, that they get a slice of the taxable profits of these 100 largest companies based on their jurisdiction sales. And these are kind of contrary principles. So on the one hand, you're giving the country of residence, the headquarter country of a company, more power to tax it when it has foreign earnings. That's the global minimum tax. When a US company has foreign earnings in a low tax jurisdiction, the minimum tax requires that company to pay more tax to the IRS in Washington, D.C. But then on the other hand, the changing of where companies pay taxes, that says a US company that has sales in foreign jurisdictions, and if it doesn't have a physical office there, or even if it does have a physical office there and it's not paying enough, then it would pay more to that foreign jurisdiction. So these principles aren't aligned, and it's kind of a trade-off between the countries that want more redistribution of where companies pay taxes and countries that want a larger share of their own companies' taxes paid to themselves. So, you know, when I think of the different jurisdictions that you mentioned, you know, I think specifically with China, a lot of companies, Chinese companies, have affiliates in low tax jurisdictions where they are able to access the global markets that investors might not necessarily invest directly in China, but they're interested in investing in the Cayman Islands affiliate of a Chinese company. So a global minimum tax would potentially erode the value of those low tax affiliates of these Chinese companies. That's kind of the same thing with some other companies around the world. You know, US companies, not as much anymore because we have our own version of a minimum tax. But when it comes to higher tax jurisdictions, I think of Japan, as you mentioned, the global minimum tax makes more sense. And same thing with Australia. Australia has been an innovator in not necessarily a good way on these anti-avoidance rules. And Australia is kind of in a position to say, we have strong anti-avoidance rules. It would make sense to harmonize those in a global minimum tax. But potentially a little more cautious when it comes to sharing the profits of its companies based on where their sales are in the world. So it's a real mix, and I think it's been a challenging set of issues to get compromise all along. But there are some folks at the OECD that feel like with the Biden administration's proposal that there is momentum to get at least some compromise and agreement, which to me will essentially be the starting gun for actually implementing any changes. And it would be years before things would be settled, and potentially years down the road, when things are getting closer to being settled, countries would decide that now is the time to reopen the agreement and change things yet again.
There are actually many questions about the minimum tax that you now mentioned several times, Daniel. One viewer is arguing that fiscal policy is part of countries' economic and social policy, and as different countries and societies have different needs, because of differences in the relative GDP or the relative state of the economic development. There are certain difference in the need for the scope and the burden imposed by tax systems, the distortion imposed by tax systems. So how do we reconcile and agree on a minimum corporate tax? This is the question. But also, let me also ask Marta to reply to this question, perhaps by rephrasing it and putting it in a different way. When you want to advance economic development, which is to the largest extent driven by private sector initiative, and when you want to promote the digitalization of the economy, when you want to promote structural renewal and structural economic change, is it actually a good idea to have, first of all, digital services taxes in place, and on top of that, perhaps minimum corporate taxes that prevent companies from utilizing preferential tax treatments that are explicitly granted to them by national governments?
Thank you, Matthias. Boy, what a question. Well, let's maybe do a quick review on why taxes are part of that very important public policy. They're such an important tool for the public policy. First, they collect revenue. They collect public revenue to finance public expense. And then second, and this I cannot stress enough, if you study any sort of tax system, always as part of a second principle or second goal of the taxation policy that the country may have is either to promote some sort of behavior, may be by businesses or companies or citizens, it doesn't matter, or to do the opposite, persuade from some sort of behavior. So, and lately with the environmental taxes, we've also seen how there is with taxation policy, there's a need to somehow internalize external costs for companies. And I mean this in that general principle for environmental taxes that go with those who contaminate must pay for it. This is a very bad translation from the Spanish way of saying it. But so we have these three principles, but let's not forget that the first one is to have this public revenue to finance the public expenses. And on this issue, which is the primary issue for the taxation policy, we need to remember those general principles that we already spoke about, that the general economic activity needs to be taxed in a similar way so as not to distort business decisions. Now, if we want to promote some sort of a behavior, either by companies or citizens, we need to think about positive discrimination or positive incentives on the taxation policy. And if you're not talking about positive incentives or active incentives on taxation policy, well, at least let's not hinder the activity with taxation policy with things such as a digital tax. So then to have my own no answer, as Daniel previously said, it's a difficult issue, of course, to find that equilibrium, that balance in what needs to be public collection and public policy and public expense. And this goes much further to in the discussion that what Adigital has been doing in the general discussion for the digital tax. It's a very interesting discussion, but I'm probably not the most adequate person to make a very constructive opinion on this. I have my own, of course, but I'm not the legitimate person to speak about it. And you had a follow-up on this, which I would translate it in my head as this very issue about fiscal dumping and taxation dumping. Again, this is a very complex issue, and on things like this is where, not as businesses, but in general as citizens, I think it's important to promote that international dialogue, those international negotiations that come to some sort of agreement to have an international taxation system that is okay with innovation, with growth, with economic wealth, and businesses creating wealth and, of course, employment and jobs, and at the same time leaving some sort of margin to the countries to have some, well, to have the fiscal policy as some sort of means of attraction to investors. Again, this is a very interesting debate, and it very often comes to either a political decision, or as I think in some countries we can see is a matter of, okay, let's attract investors via taxation policy, which I think it's legitimate.
Thank you very much. I admit it was a very complex question, but you did a very good job in replying to it. Daniel, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'll be brief. If folks are interested, they can certainly email me for more details on this proposal. But when it comes to a global minimum tax, I think it's important to design it as a true minimum tax. That means a minimum rate and a minimum base. That way, countries that are interested in attracting real activities, real investment, real employment, hiring, and long-term projects to their countries are not unduly punished by the minimum tax. So this is similar to what is being discussed as a substance-based carve-out. I would go further than something that just formulaically carves out part of substance, but I think it's really important for the minimum tax to work as a backstop to current rules against abuse rather than a barrier to real FDI, because especially when it comes to developing countries and the recovery from this pandemic, FDI is still pretty important. And you don't want to have a system that disincentivizes companies from investing and putting their assets at risk in the context of a global recovery. And I think there's a potential, especially the way the Biden administration is approaching this, essentially a potential for it to be a real penalty on cross-border investment.
Exactly, I can only agree, which is why I don't see a big window of opportunity for global agreement on a minimum tax. But let's see, we may be surprised. But yeah, let us sum up because we need to wrap up. We are running out of time. I think we had a very vivid discussion among the three of us, probably with lagging dissents and more consensus on key themes that we addressed. To sum up, taxes generally create distortions. The digital services tax creates distortion, and it creates a tax incidence which has not been taken into consideration by policymakers so far. Companies usually pay the tax, but it is ours who bear the burden of the tax. And DSTs tend to create more problems like they solve. They are like hydras, to put it that way. That would be my summary. I would like to say thank you to our two speakers, Marta Becerra from Digital and Daniel Ban from the Tax Foundation. And let's release them with a virtual applause. Thank you very much.